Thank you again for coming and supporting the museum. I'm going to turn the time over to Rick.
Thanks, Leah. Appreciate it. Night of the Museum. I love that movie, and I love this museum, so that'd be fun to come to that one. So I think I'm going to put it on my calendar. This is a treat tonight for me because I get to share one of my favorite collecting subjects, and that's Walt Disney. Frankly, we could be here for a week. And I promised my sister who may come tonight, although the traffic was bad tonight, that I try not to go over 45 minutes. So anyway, we're open to questions. We want to keep it nice. This is a man that was born at the end of December 1901. The end of the year, no, it was December 5th, but it was 1901. And he was born in rather humble circumstances in Chicago, but Walt Disney was the fourth of five children. His big brother Roy, in particular, played a big role in his life. Some would say that Roy deserves as much credit as Walt, but Roy would never say that, even though he was the financial brains and the one that kept them floating when they just about went under. Walt was the visionary. And he always appreciated his little brother Walt and always took care of him. And they were born in a home that their father, Elias Disney, that their father had built. And not a lot of people can say that. Maybe a few of us can, that we have an ancestor who built the home we were born in. I can't, but there are some that can. And it was a home that cost Elias Disney $800 to build. Now, it may not sound like much, but Elias Disney at the time was making $1 a day. So that's quite a sum of money. At any rate, they were only there till Walt was 4, and then they moved to Marceline, Missouri. And Marceline is the town he's tried to recreate and live through his youth. He was only there a few years, but it made a dramatic impression upon him. It's a little railroad town, and the railroad had a lot to do with Walt, as you know, too, over the years. Any rate, Marceline was a very small community. It only numbers 2,200. I looked it up today. So it's still a tiny community. But many of the little stores and hotels and so on that you see on Main Street, if you look close, they actually have the name Marceline on them in Disneyland and Disney World as a tribute to the town that he felt like he really grew up in. Disney's father had difficulty making a living in Marceline. There wasn't much to do there. And he had a farm, but they sold it in 1910. In the following year, the family relocated to Kansas City. There, Disney's father purchased a newspaper route. And for the next 6 years, Walt helped with deliveries, working before and after school and on weekends. In 1917, World War I, we finally entered World War I, which had been going for 3 years, from 1914 on. But Wilson said he'd keep us out of war, but he kept us out for 3 years, and then we got in because there were some big tragedies like the Lusitania that was sunk, and other things with Americans aboard, and other things that I don't want to go into tonight, but it was complicated. But we got into World War I. Young Walt was 16 years old, and he wanted to get in the war. Okay, how many young men have we known, and perhaps even some young women, that want to get involved in the fighting if something's going on? He wanted to get in, and he went down, and he tried to get in the Army, and they wouldn't let him. He was too young. So he waited a few months, and he was a very good artist, so he created his own birth certificate and dated it a year older than he was, and got in the ambulance corps. Okay, and by the time Walt got to Europe, the war was over. It was past Armistice Day, but actually, technically, the war wasn't over. If you look up World War I, it wasn't over until the middle of 1919, even though we like to think Armistice Day is the day the fighting stopped. It wasn't over till the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919. So Walt got to be an ambulance driver He was only 16. He should have been 17, but like I say, he created his own birth certificate. So that's when his art career really started. And if any of you have seen a picture of Walt with in front of his ambulance, he painted a figure right on the side of his ambulance. Well, why wouldn't Walt Disney do that, even as a young man? Well, he was sent to France in 1918, like I say, and drove there for a while. In his unit was another young man the same age by the name of Ray Kroc. I don't know if that name rings a bell, but he had something to do with McDonald's later on, and was a big businessman. They became actually lifelong friends. Well, following his service there, he moved to Kansas City, hoping to become a newspaper cartoonist. He started drawing in school. He wasn't a very good student. He liked to draw. We had Greg Olson in a class ahead of me, and he always got in trouble for drawing all day. And you know, I think some of these artistic people do that, and people are involved in other things. At any rate, he became interested in animation very early on, but the type of animation he wanted was the cutout type where you paste it on a cell, okay, not the drawing type. But he very quickly became an animator and started drawing. In 1922, he opened a film studio called Laugh-O-Gram, and it was a laugh because it closed the next year in 1923. In fact, he had several attempts that weren't in what he wanted to do that didn't work out. His big brother started selling vacuum cleaners door to door and tried to get Walt to help him sell vacuum cleaners. Just think. You know, could have been one of the world's forgotten vacuum cleaners. But all of a sudden he got a job in New York to work for an advertising agency, and he left immediately and took the job. At any rate, after producing various short animated cartoons, he started to form his own studio. Eventually, he actually worked for Universal for a while, and it was while he was there that he created his first cartoon character, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. And Oswald has looks a little, well, there have been some drawings of him that looks quite close to Walt himself, you know, except for the ears and so on. And he may have used himself as inspiration. I've seen some drawings of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit that stood about the way Walt did and were quite tall. At any rate, it was successful. Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was very lucky, and it kind of opened up for him, but basically he was cut out of ownership of Oswald, and Universal ultimately took control of the ownership of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. He was really down in the dumps when he lost Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. So he thought that was going to be his, because it was very popular. He'd gone with a lady that owned Felix the Cat, and she was excited about it, and others were jumping in on it, and then he loses it. Well, just a note on history, the Disney company got it back in a trade in 2006. So Disney now owns Oswald the Rabbit. It took long after Walt died in 1966 to do it. But it was a trade with Universal. NBC wanted to have a sports caster that was working for NBC Disney, and so that's how they made the trade to get Oswald the Rabbit back. Anyway, it was after all that miserable thing that in New York, they decided, well, he had to leave there, and he went to California, where he'd spent some time before on one of his productions that didn't go very well. And he got with his brother Roy, his big brother, and I shouldn't have looked over the fact that his first acting that he did in his life was as a schoolboy. He was picked for the part of Peter Pan in the school play. That shouldn't be a big surprise. And it was his big brother Roy that pulled the rope when he went flying, okay? So they were a team from day one. He got Roy to go with him. They always wanted, Roy tried to get him to be a vacuum salesman door to door, and finally Walt saw a little break in what he wanted to do, and he got Roy to go with him. Good he did, because Walt financially would have been on the rocks about 10 times during the ensuing years. He was a great animator, a great artist, but not much of a businessman. And that's where his big brother had the business sense to really make Disney into what it ultimately became. They were a great team together, but obviously their performance was very different. Their areas of interest and their areas of expertise were very interesting. But Roy always loved his little brother and always knew that he'd make good, especially after he couldn't talk him into selling vacuums. He knew that Walt was going to make it somewhere. So Roy Jones joins with him, and they create the Disney Brothers Studio. That's what they called it before it was Disney Productions. They're in California. And as Walt had left the train ride from losing with Universal, he started making little drawings on the train. It was a long train trip from New York to Los Angeles. And he drew what he called Mortimer Mouse. And by this point in time, he was married to Lillian, who had been an inker for him, had done some ink for some of his characters. And she says, Mortimer, that'll never go anywhere. Call him Mickey. So it was his wife that named him Mickey Mouse. Incidentally, he had a great artist that worked for him, Iworks. I finally learned to pronounce it. Interesting name. And it was that really created the look of Disney, of Mickey Mouse, as we know it. Walt drew some drawings, but it was really Iworks that created Disney, as you know. But from the very beginning, Disney was not satisfied with, when they got into the cartoons, with the voice. So Disney was actually the voice of Mickey Mouse until 1947. So the first 20-some years, he was the voice. Finally, it just became too much, and they hired another guy to be the voice. And sometimes Walt would come back and do little shorts anyway, because he thought was the only one that really knew what Mickey sounded like. So he had a hard time giving that up. The studio took off, and they created a little short. Most of them were short. So I brought today, these are the contracts going all the way back, some of them. I've got another whole set of them. Been collecting Disney for a lot of years, so it was easy to pick him to talk about today. And I've got hundreds of their contracts going all the way back to Plane Crazy, which was the first short they did in 1926, but it didn't take off, didn't have sound, and so it wasn't released. But in 1928, they put sound to Steamboat Willie, and this is one of the original drawings for Mickey Mouse, so Iworks probably drew that, because that goes back to 1928. Now, Disney didn't give up on drawing Mickey. Anytime somebody close to the family was really excited about Mickey Mouse, he would sit down and draw him out and sign it, So, but he didn't. He basically followed what Ube had set up, and then he hired other animators. At one point, Iworks felt like he wasn't getting much attention, so he left and created his own animation studio. That lasted 1 year before he came back to Disney to work. Any rate, they were a good combination too. There were several others. There was one called The Carnival Kid, where Mickey first spoke hot dog, which was 1929, and that was important because that's when Walt decided to do the voice. He didn't like it, to do the voice of Mickey Mouse, so he did it for the next 20 years. Any rate, I brought a few things from some of his movies and things I just wanted to show. Fantasia is one of my favorites, that in 1940, and I brought a letter of Leopold Stokowski, who did the music for that, and but that came after the one that he was really took a lot of heat for, and that was he had done a lot of shorts, and they were always the little cartoons that you showed before the movies, okay, in Hollywood. And he finally got the idea, well, rather than just do the funny little lead-in cartoons, why don't I do a full-length feature where people can cry at the figures as well as laugh at them. And they called it Disney's Folly when he started putting money into this. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs took longer than they thought, a year or so longer than they thought to make it. A lot of animators. I've got actually some drawings for that I couldn't find to bring today, but you can kind of picture them from having seen it. And don't ever become a collector, at least on this scale, because I can't find everything. And it's very disgusting. You only gave me 2 months since we did this last time. So I have to go on Safari all the time to find things. But I did find some of it, and it was fun to look. Anyway, it was during this time that he really hit the road running on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And he won an Academy Award in 1932, not for this, because this wasn't made till 37. This is the song Whistle While You Work from that when it was first published. And he was given an honorary Oscar in 1932 for animation. And you know, he never missed a year after that getting at least a nomination. Disney was nominated for Academy Awards 59 times, more than anybody. You think Meryl Streep's got a lot? Disney. He won 22 Academy Awards. And they say he never went thereafter, after 1932 when he got his first one, which was just an honorary one. He never went a year without getting at least one Academy Award. So he broke all of the records, and the Disney's Folly turned out to be a real hit, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And it was Shirley Temple in 1938 Academy Awards. We did one evening on Shirley Temple. That was kind of fun last year. But it was little Shirley Temple that gave the Academy Award to Walt Disney. There's a famous photo of her presenting his first Academy Award for this movie, and 7 little Academy Awards. So if you've ever seen the picture, Walt's the only one at the Academy Awards that ever got one with 7 little ones behind him. So they had to acknowledge that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had made Hollywood history, which it had. Well, from this, you know, he was almost never solvent. It's amazing as you look at the financial records and so on, how close to bankruptcy he was so many times, because he'd throw everything. He didn't care what it cost, and Roy had to figure out how to find the funds to fund his next, fun project. But Roy absolutely loved his little brother and worked his tail off trying to get the banks behind him. It was very difficult sometimes. In fact, they say that Disney would have gone under during the war if the war hadn't happened, World War II, because it was then that he got all kinds of government contracts, and he became the government's favorite animator, of course, and did a lot of films. One thing I was trying to find was he used mostly Donald Duck during World War II for a lot of the descriptions and so on. Were a lot of the cartoons and things that were used by the military and the country. Get through that. And I have one little piece of music I couldn't find, but it's a picture of Donald Duck basically kicking Hitler in the pants. And it was drawn by the Walt Disney Studio. He went after Tojo and all of them. I mean, his characters, if you saw him, you'd say, oh, I've seen that before, because his characterization of the guys we were fighting about in World War II became the things that people remember about that. A lot of things that he did during the war you wouldn't really know. One of the things he did was most of the insignias, the military insignias, were drawn by Disney, okay, Disney Studios, that were used by our military in World War II. So whatever they were, the flaming 101st or whatever they were, he would make the little drawings for the patches and for the badges and so on. And if it hadn't been for that, he would have gone under financially. But after the war, when the government pulled away from him, was a real that was a real test. At the beginning of the war, he did a film, a short called The New Spirit, which was commissioned by the U.S. Treasury Department, and it was meant to just get people to pay their taxes because the government had such huge burdens during getting out of the Depression and then paying for the war. Donald Duck was shown in thousands of movie theaters and earned an Academy Award nomination, Donald Duck. So Disney Studio also made training films, as I mentioned. They were created free of charge, more than 1,000 insignias for the military units, designs centered around established Disney characters, as well as new characters that were developed during the war. Incidentally, of all of his characters he developed, there was one of them that he hated that's quite famous, and that's this guy, Goofy. He never liked Goofy. He said he did it just out of a spirit of fun one day, but he says Goofy has no substance whatsoever to him. Okay, and so it's the only Disney character he hated that he created was Goofy. Anyway, I kind of like Goofy, but you know, a lot of people do. But that was not his favorite. Towards the middle of the war, he created a bestseller, and he read from a bestseller called Victory Through Air Power by Major Alexander Seversky, and Disney was driven by his own patriotism, decided to adopt it in a 1943 live-action animated feature of the same name, Victory Through Air Power. In order to win support for the book's theories, considered controversial by some U.S. military officials, about the strategic long-range bombing that could be brought to the war. Both President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill saw the film, which reportedly made quite an impression on them, and they ordered their militaries to try to follow what he had. Another thing he did during the war is he created in one of his wartime animations a big bomb, a single bomb that was dropped straight down like this to whack our enemies. And Churchill decided, well, why can't the British create a bomb like that? So they created what was called the Disney bomb. Actually, it didn't do very well, so it was dropped a couple times straight down, but didn't do so well. But at any rate, his ideas caught on with a lot of people during that time too. He was a train buff. He took the train, and that was on the train that he created Mortimer, Mouse, Mickey Mouse, going from New York to Los Angeles after he lost Oswald the rabbit. And so he always loved trains, and Marceline, the town they grew up in, had a train. It was a train town, little dinky town still, but it had a train that went through it. So ultimately, trains became real important. He ultimately created a little train on his property. He first had one in his office, a little train that he would show people, and he would use to relax when he was, really too busy. He'd stop himself and play with the train, little electric train he had in his office, and he'd show it off to people. If you go to Disney's office down in Disneyland, they still have a little train down there, so you can see it around his desk. Finally, he bought a Holmby area. I don't know where that is in Los Angeles, home, and he decided to create a bigger, a 1/8 size train, which he did. A good friend of mine, Grenade Curran, who was in motion pictures, grew up down there, and I got some Hollywood things from him, such as John Wayne's boots he wore in Rio Bravo, and a couple things, Sons of Katie Elder. He had been there at Walt's place working for Walt for a while when they got that train going. He had a picture of Walt had the railroad hat on, this little train, but it was 1/8 size, taking his daughters. He had 2 daughters, and he had Diane and Sharon. Diane was the only daughter they were able to have naturally, and they adopted Sharon. But he loved his daughters. He was very family oriented. And I should mention this too. when he was a young boy, he accidentally killed an owl, and he always regretted that the rest of his life. And so he wanted to make animals very important in all of his films. So you never see animals getting killed in the films that Walt Disney supervised. He was always trying to do that. And anyway, there were a lot of things that caught on from his life. One of the worst ones was that one of the worst things that happened to Walt was after Snow White was such a success, and he got the Academy Award and the Seven Little Ones and all that. There's an interesting photo of him with Shirley Temple. He bought his parents a home, a nice home. He had the money, and he bought him a home there in Hollywood. And his folks were getting a little older, and he had a contractor that was supervising a thing, but somehow something went wrong with the furnace, and his mother died in the home that he bought for his parents. Walt never got over that. His father was seriously ill but survived, Elias, but the mother died. And they say that's the reason they almost never see a mother in any of Walt's films, because he lost his mom and he couldn't get over the regret, of losing her. So it was a horrible thing in his life. But he couldn't move on from that, so he just kind of got over it. But a lot of people have speculated that's why you don't see too many mothers in the animations and other films that he did. But he was a train buff. He loved trains, and so when it came to coming to doing a big thing, he used to take his kids to Griffith Park. I've gone there many times, and they had a merry-go-round at one time, and he watched his daughters play on the merry-go-round. Incidentally, Walt never allowed his kids to go to school without him driving them to school. Until they could drive, he drove them to school every day. I mean, he had all kinds of people working for him that could have driven them, but nope, that's what he wanted to do. So he drove his kid to school every day that they went to school until they learned to get their own license, and then he reluctantly let them drive from then on. But watching his girls play on this carousel at Griffith Park, he said, wouldn't it be nice if parents had a place where they could have fun too with their kids? So the idea of a Disneyland started developing from taking his girls to this one ride at Griffith Park. Wouldn't it be fun if there were a place where you could have a lot of rides, and the adults could have rides too, and they could have them with their kids and so on. So this, he started, putting together plans for. He never had the money for Disneyland. Disneyland, he put his home and everything else up to get Disneyland going. I don't know how many of you are aware of that, but his brother Roy really had his biggest job trying to finance Disneyland. And at any rate, the initial plans for Disneyland were very small. He was going to do it by the studio, which was up in Burbank. But it turned out that property just wasn't big enough for what he had in mind. And so somebody said, hey, how about going down to Anaheim? It's got all these orange orchards. And so he bought 160 acres of orange orchards. And that became Disneyland. Construction, incidentally, began in July of 1954. Do you know how long Disneyland took to build?
1.5 years.
Yeah, 1 year. Basically 1.5 years. It was actually less than that because it was 1 year later, July 17th, that it opened. The opening day was absolutely terrible. I don't know if anybody was around. My wife says she went down Disneyland the first year. Our family went down the year my sister, who was with us, was born, 1957. Back when we drove into the parking lot, which was big by then, our next door neighbor, Dal Clark family, pulled in next to us. And so I haven't forgotten that. But Disneyland was miserable the first few years, but particularly the first day, because there were all kinds of forged tickets that were run off, and many more tickets than they could accommodate, but they were forgeries. But people got in because there was no way to check them at that time. and the concrete wasn't even dry in some areas, and the blacktop, the women wore high heels, had their heels stuck in the blacktop. Okay, and then none of the drinking fountains were on. If you can imagine that, you know, July, and even in California it was warm enough in July. People wanted to drink, but they were selling Pepsi, so pushing Pepsi at the time. So a lot of people were really mad at Disney over that because they says, well, they've just turned them off, so you have to buy a Pepsi. You know, everybody was buying Pepsi. But no, Walt had a choice. He could either pay for the plumbing for the toilets or get the fountains hooked up, and he chose the toilets. Okay, so that's why there were no fountains the opening day of Disneyland. Everybody said that was his next Disney folly to create this thing, especially way down in Anaheim, nowhere land for LA at the time. But that first day, they had a TV broadcast, and they had a fairly known actor. He wasn't a big name then, that went to and hosted the thing by the name of Ronald Reagan. And Reagan hosted that first day at Disneyland. It was seen by approximately 70 million Americans, yet the program was riddled with technical difficulties, him going off and so on. There were all kinds of problems. A lot of people would have just given up probably, but not Walt. One of the special letters I brought is this one to show you. He tried to get Bank of America to go with him, you know, because he was having a real difficult time, and he knew he had to get ABC to give him some television time, or you know this park wouldn't have the advertising it needed, and neither one of them was coming to fruition until this letter of April 1st, 1954. All I've got is the carbon copy, but it's signed by the bank, and it just says, in accordance with, this is the Walt Disney Productions gentleman, in accordance with the request contained in your letter of March 31st, 1954, and our discussion of this morning, please consider this letter our consent to the commitments obtained by you for the financing of Disneyland. So that got them going. I'm sure there was a great jubilation of the Disney boys when they got that letter. Well, it wasn't certain that it was going to. It wasn't certain that it was going to go too far at the time, but it did, and it really took off, and the rest is history. I don't know what we need to talk a lot about the rest. I brought a couple of pictures of Walt with a couple of his trains down at Disney World. One of the contracts, one of my favorite movies. We probably all have favorites, right? But one of my favorites, because I was raised on scouting, and I really miss it. I had a scout museum in Provo for about 10 years, and I miss the fact that we're not locally much into scouting. I'm still a member of the Provo Kiwanis Club, and we sponsor a scout troop still, so I'm grateful for that. But only about 20% of the LDS church is still in scouting, and that's because they had to do it on their own, basically. I don't want to say it's a mistake, but I think it's sad that there wasn't an alternative, ready for them. There's no equivalent eagle in the church yet, and I hope by maybe talking about it, the brethren will get going and get something, because I think the boys need that. And I think the young ladies also need a similar program, they never adopted Girl Scouts, but I think that's another thing that could be accomplished and needs to be. But one of my favorite movies was Follow Me, Boys, that Disney put out. It had a lot of favorite actors and actresses in it. Vera Miles, incidentally, played the wife. Fred McMurray on that is LDS. She's quite active, and she's in her older years now. She's in her 90s in California. So there is a connection there to us, and to many of us. Some of us are not LDS, but her family came from this area originally. And this is the agreement where Walt and Roy signed their interest in Follow Me, Boys. You can see there's Roy's signature, there's Walt. So you got the two boys on here. Virtually almost every of these contracts are all signed by Roy. All of these bank commitments, all of these, everything. I mean, if it hadn't been for Roy in the financial end, there wouldn't have been any Walt Disney productions, okay? Which I think makes it interesting in one other way, and I need to close, and that is that Walt was a very interesting guy. He was, in many ways, he was very strong. In other ways, just like the rest of us, he had issues. And one of those is when his employees tried to organize into a union. And he always felt like he was a good daddy to them all. That's kind of the way he looked at himself. So he was really ticked off, okay, by this effort. So when the House Un-American Activities Committee started pulling in people in the late 40s from Hollywood, most of them tried to avoid going to have their testimonies heard. Walt volunteered. After all, he worked with the government through the war, and he wanted to say that yeah, there were communists in Hollywood. That was the big thing at the time, and he blamed the people who were trying to organize his union being communists. Well, I don't think he had that right, but you know, he had a bone to pick, and that's the way his. If you read his testimony, it's not really that glorious on Walt, but he took it really personally, and a real offense. They tried to organize his his place. Walt got cancer, and it was only figured out a few months before he passed away in 1966. He'd been a chain smoker his whole life, and I guess his lungs finally gave out in 1966. And before he died, he was designing a huge ski resort. He wanted to build a big ski resort up in the mountains of Sequoia area in California. And he poured several million into it. It was going to cost him another $15 million to do it. He also was working on Disney World, and that was going to take a lot of money. The problem got solved when Walt died, because they said he probably would have moved ahead with the ski resort. But because of that, we got the Bears family reunion at the ride at Disneyland. That was never, the ski resort was abandoned. And when it came to building this huge, his idea that never came to fruition was this self-contained city called Epcot, which was Disney's dream to build. Never happened. Epcot became part of Disney World, as you know. And it was left to his big brother Roy, who survived him, to run the operation. Roy always wanted to be in the background, and when they came to Roy after Walt had been buried, and they said, well, you're our new chief, we'll name it Disney World. And he said, absolutely not. It's going to be Walt Disney World. And so that's why it got named Walt Disney World. He loved his little brother. He felt like his brother deserved all the credit. He didn't, but he gave it to him. And I think that said something about Roy, the big brother. He was always a good big brother to him. Anyway, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for letting me share a little on this.